Hey, it's me again, your favorite Texas trucker, and I'm on home time. My last video, just real short one, just kind of showed you the tattoo studio and let you know what I was doing on home time. So now what I want to do, I don't have a lot of time today because I do need to get ready for this tattoo that I'm fixing to do. But I want to talk to you about HHG versus practical route. When you get a job at Millis and some other companies, they're going to give you two choices. The choices are going to be whether you want to take per diem or non-per diem. Now, some companies don't give you that choice, but Millis does. They'll give you a choice to whether you want to take per diem versus non-per diem. And in one of my previous videos, I discussed the differences between those choices, and and so you can make a decision about that. Based on that video. Alright, the second decision that you have to make is whether you want to choose HHG versus practical route. Okay, and that'll determine what your pay is. Now, they get different base pay because there's different mileages involved. Alright, so let's say that. Alright, first let me explain to you what HHG is. Now, household goods route is a route that determines distance, dispatch distance, from zip code to zip code. Alright, so let's say that you're traveling from a zip code here in Weatherford, Texas, which is 76086, to another zip code in Texas, which is 76077. Okay, which, if I remember correctly, is down in the Houston area. All right. What they do is they determine from the approximate center of that zip code to the approximate center of the next zip code. All right, and then they determine that distance in a straight line as the bird flies, so they say. All right, and so problem with that is that when you drive that route, you're not driving the distance that they're dispatching you on, almost ever, never. Because for one thing, you don't go from center of zip code to center of zip code. For another thing, you don't drive in a straight line. Okay, but that's how they determine it. If you look in your Rand McNally Atlas, or there's other sources that'll tell you distance from city to city, that's what they're doing, is they're giving you zip code to zip code. So say I want to know the difference from Fort Worth, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia. Okay, then I can go to the Rand McNally Atlas, I can find Fort Worth, I can carry it over on the graph to Atlanta, Georgia, and it'll give me a mileage. Okay, that is HHG route. It's zip code to zip code, city to city. Okay. And it's not usually accurate. Matter of fact, it's usually pretty inaccurate. So let's say, for instance, that zip code to zip code dispatches you on 200 miles. Okay, you have to travel 200 miles to get from point A to point B according to your HHG route. Well, when you plan your route and you plot your route and you drive your route, you might be anywhere from 250 to 300 miles. Depending on how the roads travel, where your addresses are in those zip codes. Now, if you travel to say you travel from the far west of Fort Worth to the far east of Atlanta, okay, in order to drop there. Well, Fort Worth is a fairly sizable city. Atlanta is a fairly sizable city. And so your mileage is not going to be accurate. On top of that, you're not driving a straight line to get there. Although I-20 is pretty straight, you're still not driving a straight line to get there. So that's HHG route. The HHG route doesn't take into consideration any of the roads that you have to travel. It's simply a straight line distance from point A to point B. All right. Practical route. Practical route is completely different. Practical route is address to address. Okay, so let's say that you go from a shipper, we'll say the Miller Brewery here in Fort Worth, and you go to, or let's do it in reverse, and let's say that in Atlanta you go to Owens Brockway, which ships glass, and you bring it to Castle and Cook, which receives that glass for the Miller Brewery, all right, in Fort Worth. All right, so so you go to the address of Owens Brockway in Atlanta, and you take that shipment to the address at Castle and Cook in Fort Worth using the shortest practical route for your truck to drive on. All right, what that means is, as in practical, it means that if it's not practical for you to drive on that road, it's not included in your practical miles. Okay, so let's say that there's a route that's shorter than the route that you would normally take, but it's a truck restricted route. Let's say it's got a low bridge, or it's got a weight restriction, or it's got a bridge restriction, okay, that forbid trucks from driving on it. Okay, that would not be the route that you would be dispatched on, because it's not a practical route for a truck. Okay. However, what they do is the dispatcher has a computer program that's a navigational program. And different dispatchers or different companies use different programs, and they're not all the same. So I don't know what program that your dispatcher would be using. I don't even know what program our dispatcher uses. But it's my understanding that they use the Rand McNally mapping system, and so they determine the practical route, and as it shows up when they plot point A to point B into their navigational program from address to address, and it gives them a set of miles. Okay, that's the set of miles that you should be running, and so you'll get dispatched. So let's say it's and I don't know exactly, but let's say it's 891 miles. Okay, that's what you get dispatched on. So 891 miles is the shortest practical route to get from the address at Owens Brockway in Atlanta to Castle and Cook in Fort Worth. Okay, now may not be the route that you take. You may have a more preferred route, or you may know that there's a lot of construction on one of those roads and you're going to avoid that construction, so you're going to take a detour around it. Instead of running through a city, you may decide to take the loop around the city, which may add 10 or 15 miles to your distance. A perfect example of that is up in Chicago. Instead of running 90-94 through Chicago, you take 294 around Chicago. Okay, it adds about 15 miles worth of distance to your route. So when dispatch plans you, if you're planning to go through Chicago, then they plan you to take the shortest practical route, which is through the middle of Chicago. Not very many drivers actually do that. So practical route is the distance from zip code to zip code, and that's the goal that you want to hit. You want to get as close to that as possible. Why do you want to get as close to that as possible? Alright, well, first off, with HHG you can't get as close to it as possible. Well, I mean, you can get as close as you can, but you're not going to hit it, because doesn't take roads into consideration when they determine the mileage. So on HHG route, you just do your best with it, and you're not going to get paid what you're driving, which is why typically your pay grade is just a little bit higher than what it is on the practical route. All right, because on the practical route, you're getting paid for the miles that you can actually drive. Okay, in the HHG route, it's impossible to drive the miles that you're dispatched on. You're always going to be over. I can't think of a single time when you might be under those miles. So because you get paid by the mile, and because the time it takes to make those miles equates to money in your pocket or money out of your pocket, I don't prefer the HHG route. I personally have an issue with driving more miles than what I'm getting paid. Okay, so on the practical route, which is what I chose, I do my best to get my miles as close to the dispatch miles as possible, or even under. And I have come under quite a few times. I've come under as many as 20 miles. All right. You know, and I always feel good about that, because if I come under 20 miles, say I'm getting dispatched on 791 miles, but I can make that run 771 miles, well, I'm getting 20 free miles of pay. I'm getting paid for 20 miles that I didn't actually drive. However, if I get dispatched on 791 miles and it takes me 810 miles to get there, well, now I'm losing 19 miles. Okay, so now I'm driving 19 miles that I'm not getting paid for, and I don't like that at all. I just kind of, you know, I just don't like that. So my goal is under practical route, and because I don't know the route that the dispatcher is using to determine what my miles are, I try as best as possible to take the shortest route with the least amount of miles from point A to point B, being from the shipper to the receiver. All right, and I try to do it in the shortest amount of time possible. Okay, so you have options when you plan your route. Okay, you can plan your route to stay only on interstates and major highways. All right, and you can get normally you can get, for the most part, from where you're picking up to where you're delivering at without having to add a whole lot in the middle. Okay, it's not always possible, but normally you can. Or you can do like I do and choose to take state highways and U.S. highways. And so I include state highways and U.S. highways in all of my routes. The downside to that is that usually those highways have a speed limit of 55 miles an hour, and a lot of times they run through towns, so they have stoplights and stop signs in going through these towns, as well as reduced speed limits. So you have a trade-off. Okay, you can add miles to the route, and you can get from point A to point B on an interstate doing, 62 to 65, 66 miles an hour, depending on how your truck is governed. Or you can stay on the state highways and the interstate, state highways and U.S. highways, cut a considerable amount of miles out of your trip and get there essentially the same amount of time. A lot of people will say shortest route's not always the fastest route, and that's true. The shortest route is not always the fastest route. Perfect example of that is running through the middle of Chicago. You take 90 and 94 through Chicago, it's going to take you a lot longer to get through Chicago than it is taking the loop around Chicago and bypassing it. The reason for that is because Chicago is full of congested traffic and it's full of construction. So you have these construction zones that can take you 2-3 hours to get through. You bypass all that by going around the loop and getting around it. Okay, that's a perfect example. But you're also not going that far out of route. Okay, instead of going through the center of Chicago, you're simply skirting the edge of Chicago and you're catching it back up on the actual route at the far end of it. So you're really not going that far out of route. But let's say, for instance, that you take a south-facing interstate to connect to a west-facing interstate. And you go south, and then when you hit that western running interstate, you cut west to get where you're going. Or you can take state and U.S. highways that don't go straight south and west, but they cut that diagonal out, and they cut that whole section out. So instead of cutting out, adding 10, 15 miles to your trip by going around the city and saving time, what you're doing here is you're maybe cutting 60, 70 miles off of your trip, and you're not losing very much time. Okay, so the interstate, sure, it runs 65 miles an hour, some places 70 miles an hour, and you can run that route at a higher rate of speed, and so you have the illusion of progress. Okay, but that's a lot of times that's all it is an illusion of progress. You have steady movement, and so because you have steady movement, you're making good time. But if you take the U.S. highways and state highways, making sure that you're not on a truck restricted route, you take the U.S. highways and the state highways and you run those at 55 miles an hour, even stopping in these towns for these stoplights and stop signs, you're running at a lower rate of speed, but you're cutting so many miles out of your trip that you're saving yourself time. Okay? A lot of times that practical route is going to take those roads into consideration because there's no reason why you can't drive on them. Okay, You can drive on those roads. You can drive the truck on those roads. They're not truck restricted routes. They don't have low bridges. They don't have weight restricted bridges. They don't have weight restricted roads. You can run those roads. A lot of drivers just simply don't want to because they have to run at 55 miles an hour, and they have stoplights and stop signs through towns. Okay. When I come down from Wisconsin to go to Texas, most drivers, including my trainer, would take the Oklahoma toll road over to Big Cabin, and then from Big Cabin down south into Texas. I refuse to do that, and I absolutely refuse to do it because, one, I'm not going to pay out of pocket for a toll, and our company doesn't cover the toll road in Oklahoma. I mean, they'll reimburse you for it, but you can't use your Easy Pass to get through it. Your Easy Pass doesn't pay for it. So I go down to I-40, cut it over in south, down into Texas, bypass all the toll roads. There is exactly a 2-minute difference between the two routes. 2 minutes. That's it. 2 minutes. There's no problem with my route. There's no truck restricted routes. They're good roads. Plenty of truck stops all along the route. You know, you go to Oklahoma, you have almost no truck stops. You have a toll road. You have roads that are in horrible condition. And then it's like you have a town every 20 miles. So you're constantly stopping and starting and stopping and starting after you hit Big Cabin. I hate the route. I absolutely hate it. And to avoid it, because I can stay on these state highways and the interstate going down to I-40 and cutting over into Oklahoma and then south from there, I go through very few small towns. I don't have to stop hardly at all. Every now and again I do have a few towns, but it's steady movement, and I have a 2-minute time difference between the two. Okay, so I take state highways, U.S. highways a lot. I do it a lot, and don't get me wrong. There's been times when I've gotten on one and I've second guessed myself. You'll have seen one of my videos where I was driving through Kentucky, and I think the highway was 192 or something like that. Anyway, it's a twisty road that runs through Kentucky. The part in the video wasn't that bad. I was talking about how tight the roads were, and you can't really tell from the video, but my left tire was riding the yellow line nearly the entire time because the road was so narrow. Before I started the video, there were some turns that were so tight that I had to take up both sides of the road on a blind curve in order to make the turn. And it's a little concerning when you get on a road like that. Trucks, in my opinion, don't belong on that road. Now that I know that road is how it is, I doubt I'll take it again. Okay, even though I got through it with no mishaps, I doubt I'll take it again. I mean, there were just turns that were just amazingly difficult to make on that road, and in the video you don't see any of that. In the video it had straightened out a little bit. It wasn't anywhere near as bad, but that's a perfect example. But it's not a truck restricted route, and that's why I chose it. My GPS picked that route. I looked at it, I second guessed it, I took out my Ram McNally Atlas, I looked at it on the Atlas. It's not a truck restricted route. I ran it, and so occasionally you get a time like that and it doesn't work out. But back to the main part of the discussion is that the practical route takes in the shortest practical route from point A to point B. Okay. All right, let's assume that you're using a trucker GPS. Now, and I know a lot of these truckers hate them. They hate people talking about GPSs, so you should never use a GPS. Always planned by the Ram McNally Atlas. Hey, I respect them. Yeah, I know 30 years ago they didn't have GPSs. Truckers didn't get to use GPSs. And, when my grandpa was a kid, he walked, 5 miles to school, uphill, both ways, in the snow, barefoot, It's a different age. You know, it's a new world. So this is not going to make me popular with some truckers, but get over yourself. You know, it's not the 1920s anymore. You use every tool available to you, every single one, all of them. You don't discount any of them. You use every tool available to you. So if you should have a Rand McNally Atlas, that should be your first tool. You use it. If you have the Trucker GPS, that's your second tool. Use it. Okay? Trucker GPS has all or most of the truck restricted routes, low bridges, and and stuff like that in there. The better the GPS, the better the route information will be. You plug it in, you pick it for the shortest possible miles. That's your practical route. That's how dispatch determines what you're getting paid for. So you put it in there. That's your shortest practical route. The route that puts you on will more than likely be the same route or close to it as the route that dispatches you on. Okay, on practical route. All right, now, with that said, you don't ever rely on any of your tools 100%, okay? Here's a perfect example. All right, let's say I want to go to an address in Waco, Texas, okay? You pick the address in Waco, Texas. I don't care what it is. But let's say I want to go to 2111 Johnson Avenue. I don't even know if the road exists. Well, let's say that's where I want to go. 2111 Johnson Avenue, Waco, Texas. And I'm picking up at I don't know, we'll say 615 East 3rd Street in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, I don't even know if the address exists. I'm making this shit up as I go along. Okay? So all you have, because you've listened to these hardcore truckers, all you have is a Rand McNally Atlas. That's the only thing you have to go to get where you're going. And if you can do it, great. No more power to you. I can do it. All right. If you can do it, more power to you. You should be able to do it if you're going to be a trucker. Now you plan your route out. Problem is, the Rand McNally Atlas doesn't have a map for Waco, Texas. So how are you going to find your location? The Rand McNally Atlas doesn't have, I don't know, maybe it does have a map of Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia is a pretty good sized place, but it's not going to be a highly detailed map of Atlanta, Georgia. Maybe it'll have your address on it, maybe it won't. So, you take what interstate you're going to take to get where you're going. After you flip through 15 different pages trying to, figure out what connects and where, you're gonna plan your route out. You know what interstates to take to get to your let's say you're going from Alabama to pick up here in Atlanta, but you don't know where the address in Atlanta is. You know how to get to Atlanta, but you don't know where you got to be at in Atlanta. All right, so hey, they got Qualcomm, and the Qualcomm's got directions that have been input by other drivers. So you put in your request for directions on your Qualcomm, and it sends you a list of directions for for your Georgia address. All right. So you put in your request for directions for Waco, and you get this message back that say no directions found. Please enter directions to the location requested. And now what the fuck do you do? So now you've got your Qualcomm instructions to go to the address in Georgia, but they've done a bunch of construction now a bunch of construction in that area, and now your directions are no good anymore. You get down there and you get to take the exit that the directions tell you to take, but the exit's not there anymore because they've moved the freaking exit, or they've done construction and there's roads that didn't exist on your direction. So, let's say the exit is there and you take the exit, but there's a bunch of roads that have been built, added on, in that area for whatever reason. They did that in St. Louis. I got lost in St. Louis because of that. All right, so your directions tell you to take the first left, and you take the first left, but the first left has only been there for a couple of months. The first left used to be 2 miles down the road, Now you're in a subdivision and you don't know how to get out of it. You don't know where you're at and you're all turned around. Why? Because the directions are old. They're no good. They don't ever update them. So now what do? You know? You got to call the receiver, or you got to call the shipper now, and you got to tell the shipper, you know, I'm lost. I don't know where you're at. Can you help me? Give me directions to where you're at. Or you have to call your dispatcher, and he's got to pull you up on a GPS and give you directions to where you're going. You know, or, you know, you just got to get lucky and get yourself turned around and get back out of there and figure it out. Why go through all that? I mean, why do it? To show that you're some kind of a super trucker? Use every resource available. All of them. Every one of them. Don't discount any resource that exists for you to do your job better. And man, for these older truckers that are like, this dude ain't been driving long enough to know what the hell he's talking about, hey, that's cool. You know, y'all think what you want. I have a Garmin Diesel GPS and I use it all the time. All the time. I plan my routes through my Rand McNally, and I don't write my directions down so that I can have to sit there and try to read them in the dark. And I don't write them on my windshield with a dry erase marker so that I can't see them in the dark, you know, because I drive in the dark a lot. What I do is I program my GPS, because my GPS is technologically advanced and allows you to not just take a pre-designated route, but to program turn by turn your own route into the GPS. And so what I'll do is I'll program my address and the address that I'm going to in, and it'll set an address, and then I'll go through it turn by turn by turn by turn by turn, step by step by step by step by step, and I'll say, I don't want to go on that road, and I'll change the route to avoid that road. Or there's a shorter route, I'll change the route to take that shorter route. I may try 4 or 5 different routes before I actually go anywhere until I've got the route that I like the best. I've got a tablet that has Google Earth on it. I usually stop a stop or so before I get to my destination, and I plug in the address in Google Earth so I can look at it. I see where it's at. I bring up my GPS. I compare the roads to make sure I'm going to the same location. If I'm not going to the same location, I stop right there and I reprogram everything. I've got a GPS program on my phone. I use the GPS program on my phone to check my progress on the GPS on the dash. I use the directions on the Qualcomm. I bring those directions up on the Qualcomm so that I can compare those directions on the Qualcomm that take me to the receiver or the shipper with the directions that I have programmed into my GPS. Use every resource available to you. All of them. And if somebody tells you that you're not a trucker because you use a GPS, just ignore them. You know? Okay, so they're going to die in another 10 years. They've already lived since they first invented the wheel. They've been driving since they first invented the wheel. They're going to die in 10 years anyway. They probably don't even know how to use a GPS. You know? They've been doing this shit so long that they've forgotten that, you know, they're not driving the same truck they drove in the 1920s. The truck they're driving is computerized. So they have inadvertently moved into the technological advanced world without even realizing it. You know, you don't want to use a GPS, don't use one of these computerized trucks. Go back and get you one of the 1980s.